punch shit out of the mic, sorry. There's a really common phrase that goes, the medium is the message. Basically what it means is that the medium that is used to communicate a certain message will inform the message itself. For example, a story that's told on TikTok is going to be a lot different than if it were told on a YouTube video, or if it were told on a TV show, or if it was told through a movie, or through a book, or through a comic, things like that. I think that video games in general are interesting to be studied through this lens, but I think specifically you can see what I'm talking about when we talk about a game like Metal Gear Acid 2 on the PSP. Metal Gear Acid 2 is a really interesting reinterpretation slash spin-off of the Metal Gear Solid series, and it does a really good job of adapting itself to its environment of the PSP while also being able to kind of keep the roots of a Metal Gear Solid game, but also remixing it enough to have a completely different tone and texture than the other ones. This adaptation to the PSP is what I was talking about in the intro, how the medium informs the message. I think there are a lot of smart and interesting choices that this game makes that they either wouldn't have considered or potentially wouldn't have gone with if it wasn't on a handheld device. I know when I start talking about this and how Metal Gear Acid 2 kind of redesigned everything and remixed everything in order to fit itself onto a handheld, people are going to bring up how Peace Walker was also on a handheld and how a lot of the things that I'm going to bring up aren't also included in that. My reason for kind of framing this whole thing like this is that I think that Metal Gear Acid 2 is just a really great example for the idea of the medium is the message in relation to transferring a game series onto a handheld. I think that they made a lot more changes or concessions and kind of took into account that they were going to be on a handheld device way more than Peace Walker did. That's not me saying Peace Walker is a bad game. It's a great game. I just think that Metal Gear Acid 2 understood the limitations of a handheld and attacked those challenges more distinctly than Peace Walker did, and so it's a lot easier to use this game as an example of that aspect than Peace Walker is. There were a number of hurdles that you would have had to have cleared when you're making a game for the PSP during that time, and one of them is the small screen. It's very difficult to make out details. The person is outside, there could be glare. It's not the most ideal environment to communicate a lot of details and be able to delineate a lot of things on such a small screen. So I think it's really cool and interesting that they decided to go with this kind of high contrast, high saturated, like neon punk aesthetic with a lot of these bright colors, a lot of these purples and greens and yellows, and have these very, very thick outlines for everything, so that if everything is being shown on a PSP screen and it's a little bit farther away and a little bit smaller than a normal TV, you're going to be able to delineate what's what and kind of make out things a lot easier than if the art style was more in line with something from, say, Metal Gear Solid 2 or 3 or even 1 for that matter. Another interesting change that they made was how dialogue is delivered to you and how characters actually speak and communicate the story to you. If you played a Metal Gear Solid game, you probably are aware of its very stylistic, I'd say monologuing, other people might say rambling, where they're speaking a very flowery language and kind of repeating themselves sometimes, and everything kind of sounds like poetry and it kind of sounds like a play, and it's all very dramatic and melodramatic, and it's great and very much a part of the texture of a Metal Gear Solid game. However, this is all happening on a handheld and not on a TV screen, so you're probably not going to be able to sit and let these scenes wash over you and play out and everything like that. No, you might have to get up to do the dishes, you might have to make your train stop, you might have to, put it in your pocket to do something really quickly, so they can't have a lot of these scenes play kind of continuously without you ever having the ability to stop it. On top of all of those pre-rendered or even in-game cutscenes cost a lot of memory, which they would have to be very aware of because, again, it's on a PSP handheld. So what they instead did was what a lot of handheld games do, which is have the dialogue boxes pop up in kind of shorter sentences and allow the player to choose when to progress at their own pace. This doesn't mean that they weren't able to still communicate character and tone and everything like that. They weren't able to still go on those classic Metal Gear Solid monologues and everything. It's just that they had to reinterpret it for the style that they were going for with this text-based delivery. going back to the idea that all this is going to be on a handheld, and so the player is going to do a lot of starting and stopping in terms of interacting with the game, you can see that problem attempting to be solved in kind of the overall structure of the game as well. What I mean by that is that typically most levels, except for the ending ones that take a really long time, you're going to find yourself really only playing the game or playing through a level for maybe like 10, maybe 15 minutes. And then in between then, you're going to have the text-based cutscenes like I talked about earlier, and then it's going to kick you into the menu where you're able to save or replay a level or rebuild your deck or any of that stuff. What allows is that caters to that start-stop style of play that I was talking about that you typically find with handheld games, because again, people typically aren't going to be sitting down dedicating a whole lot of time to these. They're going to be able to only play a couple of minutes or however long every so often. So the game needs to kind of structure itself around that starting and stopping style of play. I think the most interesting reinterpretation they did that kind of goes into my next point about really keeping the roots of a Metal Gear Solid game is how they reinterpreted the stealth aspect and the actual gameplay of a Metal Gear Solid game into a handheld. So what I mean by that is that you can look at a Metal Gear Solid game and you can see, okay, so it is a stealth kind of action game. It is third person and it is all happening in real time. Again, we kind of already talked about how one of the big limitations of a handheld is that you are going to be starting and stopping a lot. So what I think is really interesting is that they basically kept all of the other things and instead turned it into a turn-based game, and they made it way more tactics-based. And what's interesting about that is that everything that is present in Metal Gear Acid 2 is present in other Metal Gear Solid games. They're just taking the gameplay of a Metal Gear Solid game and choosing to tweak it so that they could focus on different facets of a Metal Gear Solid gameplay style that are already there. I've always conceptualized stealth games of having generally 3 different phases for every stealth encounter. That's the information gathering, the planning, and then the executing of said plan. So in a Metal Gear Solid game, you enter into a room or a space or zone or whatever, and immediately you try to identify where all of the challenges are. Are there any cameras? Are there any claymores? Are there any enemies? Things like that. You also try to see where your objective is in this room. Are there rations I need to get? Do I need to get the frickin' PS1G from in here? Do I need to disable these bombs? A bunch of stuff like that. After you've assessed and kind of gathered all the information that you need to gather, you then execute a plan. I need to go this way so that I can knock out this card, so I can throw this thing over here so that I can get the PSG one. And then you execute on it. Now again, there might be a mistake or there might be a switch up that you weren't expecting, so then you maybe have to go back to the information gathering phase. Maybe you don't have time for that, so you jump back to the planning phase, then you quickly replan on the fly and then execute on it. But whenever you're playing a stealth game, you're kind of always going through these 3 different steps of gathering information, setting up a plan, and executing on that plan. What Metal Gear Acid 2 does that I think is really cool is that they put way more emphasis on the first 2, the information gathering, and especially more emphasis on the planning phase. So they've done this cool thing where they've taken the same genre or the same style of gameplay, and through a change in emphasis and change in focus, they made the entire game play completely differently than other Metal Gear Solid games, but still feel like a Metal Gear Solid game. It's very interesting. Them choosing to make this game turn-based also tackles the problem of this game needing to be start and stop, because you could just play your turn and then pause the game and then come back to it. I actually did that a bunch as I was playing this game. I think that the biggest way this game diverges, but also a huge way that this game pays homage or keeps the tone and texture of a Metal Gear Solid game, is through the card system, which I'm going to go into. The card system is going to be how you basically do anything in a level: move around, interact with characters or objects, deal damage, things like that. Basically, at the beginning of every turn, you draw a certain amount of cards, and then depending on how many actions you have, you're able to use some of those cards to either do what they actually say, like shoot a gun at something or throw a grenade at something, or you can spend it to move around. Each of these cards have a specific cost, which when you use them raises your, I think it's called cost meter, and then your next turn is determined by how low your cost amount is at the end of your turn. So if you have 2 characters and and one of them ends their turn with a cost of 10 and the other one ends with a cost of 4, the character with a cost of 4 is going to have their turn before the other character because their cost was lower. And with those specific rules, they're able to really play around with a lot of the gameplay of this. So you can have specific cards that when you damage an enemy, it increases their cost so they're not able to do as many turns. Or you can have cards that lower your cost so you're able to kind of do a bunch of moves and then lower your cost so you can basically go again. Or you can have cards that activate at the beginning of your turn. Or you can do something like how they do bleeding, where damage is dealt every time a cost ticks down. There's a lot of very interesting things with this rule set that they've created that they do a lot to play around with. This also includes how they deal with movement. Everything is grid-based. Even the cutscenes deal in this kind of grid-based style of movement and everything like that. And with that, they're able to do a lot of really interesting things in terms of verticality, in terms of like death pits, because if you fall off of a mat into a pit, you instantly die. And so there are some of these levels that have a lot of these pits, and the kind of standard melee automatically moves a character over to the side, and so you're able to play around with that as well. It's interesting because every single mechanic or aspect of this game's unique card and movement system is used by one level or another, and it's kind of taken to its creative end. You can really tell with some of these levels of like, oh, someone discovered that you could do that with the system and they really wanted to make it into the game. It's very cool because this game has this air of experimentation and kind of like punk to it, which I think is really cool. There's a level that has a train that comes in, and it comes in every set amount of cost, and so you have to maneuver through these platforms before the train's cost runs out, and then it comes by and it does a lot of damage. There is a mission where Snake's HP is basically like 1 HP because of the narrative, and so you have to figure out how to navigate this level without basically getting hit at all. There's a mission where you have to position your character because they have like these divining rods and you need to position them on a specific grid. There are these little outcuts in levels that you see and you're like, I don't even know what can go in there. That turns out only the Nikita missiles can go in there. So if you brought the Nikita missile card, you could unlock a specific thing because only that thing can be exploded by a Nikita missile. Even the final boss has like this interesting thing where you're able to see what move it's going to use next, and you're able to plan a few steps ahead because you have to, because it does a lot of damage. And so it's this interesting way of them taking all of the sliders and mechanics and building blocks that they've given themselves and trying to rebuild them or reinterpret them in every way they can think of. Very smart design. And I say all of that and how it like diverges from a standard Metal Gear Solid game and how it feels like real punk and experimental and everything with its art style and mechanics and all of that stuff, but it also does a really good job paying homage to the Metal Gear Solid series and also kind of feels like it belongs with those other games in terms of tone and texture. One of the really easy ways they do that is through the cards themselves. Most of these cards are references to the other Metal Gear Solid games. So there is a flamethrower card that is the Fury from Metal Gear Solid 3. There is a card that allows you to draw extra cards that I think is either called Mother or Olga or something, which is Olga from Metal Gear Solid 2. There is a Meryl card from Metal Gear Solid 1 that allows you to like lower your costs or something like that. There's a Fat Man one that lets you blow up all the bombs you place, and they do some really deep cuts on some of these too. There are a bunch of cards that I didn't even know the references for. They also have this really interesting thing called the Solid Eye Theater, which basically, I'm pretty sure there was like a peripheral, like a physical peripheral that you would slap your PSP into, and it basically plays a bunch of cutscenes that you can select from other Metal Gear Solid games, and I thought it was really cool. I couldn't watch any because it was kind of in this like double vision type thing, thing, but it was really cool that it was in there. And kind of even the story too hits a lot of the quote-unquote classic Metal Gear Solid notes of child exploitation and experimentation due to war. There's obviously a Metal Gear failed kind of like soldier experiments. There's a lot of dealing in genome and memories and things like that. Obviously there's like government corruption and subterfuge and things like that. I do want to highlight though that there is an extreme amount of sexualization in this game that I know that the ongoing internet joke is like all of these games are very sexualized and everything, but this game kind of takes the cake for me in the whole series, where I would be watching a scene or playing a level or something and I would kind of just get like a little bit uncomfortable with how the characters were talking or like depicted or something like that. It was a bit too much for me. I'm gonna go over some dissonant notes before I end with my closing thoughts, but here we go, rapid fire. My notes. While I was playing the game, I really wished that the multiplayer was still online and active. I saw that it was there, but I couldn't interact with it. It wasn't active for me, which sucked. I thought it was interesting how the dialogue portraits were very reminiscent of the Metal Gear Solid portraits that have that very specific art style, specifically used in the promotional material. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but the editor will pull it on screen. While I really like the turn-based style of this game and the pace of it, I thought it would have been cool that at the end of each of the levels it would replay the missions in normal speed, kind of how that turn-based John Wick game did at the end of each of the successful levels. The boss fights in these games are hard. Specifically, the final boss fight is incredibly hard. You are going to have to replay levels and grind and make your deck kind of broken in order to beat that boss in a normal amount of time. I always look for it in deck building games like this. There is an auto build deck feature. However, I didn't end up using it because I didn't really think it was super good. Frankly, all the decks that they built I never really liked, and so I just built my own for each level, which you end up kind of having to do because you don't really know what you're getting into until you play it. So it's just strange loop of go into the level, potentially fail it or restart it, build the deck for what you now realize that you're gonna be encountering, and then go into that. Final two dissonant notes were that I really liked the character designs and I also liked the mech designs in this game. I specifically really liked Vince's design and also Snake's. I didn't realize that I would like purple on Snake, but I actually really liked it. And then the final note was that I thought it was really weird that they wrote this story that had a grown man and like a child, but it like technically isn't a child, but they're talking about how in love they are, but like you're looking at it and you're like, that's a child, dude. It kind of falls in line with the weird, like, no, but she's actually 400 years old. Like, that's a kid. Like, that was weird, man. Why'd you do that? Back to a more serious note, two of the big things that I thought of while I was playing this game was that it's very interesting that a game series like Metal Gear Solid that is so steeped in one creator's or like a group of people's creative vision was able to be taken and reinterpreted by other people. And having that creator's vision, I know that Kojima was like a producer or something like that, but having their vision still be so present in the game when they didn't really work on it and they weren't super hands-on on it. I thought that that was a real testament to the strength of the creative vision that was in all the other games, that even if you took the original creator out of the equation, it still is very present in there. And I thought that was very cool, like a testament to the strength of that vision overall. Another thought that made me kind of sad, and so I'll leave you being a little bit sad like I was that I think from the kind of pivot and overall game industry migration away from handheld devices like the PSP, I know that the Switch is technically also a handheld, but you know what I mean, that we don't really get a whole lot of games like these anymore. What I mean by that is like we don't really get a whole lot of games where you take an IP or like a standing game series and you give it to a different team or a smaller team or something like that, and they kind of are able to remix it a little bit or reinterpret it because it's going on a handheld, and so the quote-unquote rules are a little bit different regarding that. Because everything is quote-unquote console now, you don't really get that opportunity to let IPs experiment a little bit. And I guess that hole is being filled by indie titles now. It's just that they're not taking the direct IP itself, they're just taking like the idea of the IP. You know, it's a lot of games inspired by as opposed to games within the series. But that made me a little sad that, like, because of the change in the industry, games like Metal Gear Solid 2 don't really exist anymore. And I don't know, I think that is the thing that is worth preserving, and I don't really know how we preserve it. I guess what I said, like, through indie games is how we do it. If Metal Gear Acid 2 was made today, it probably wouldn't be called Metal Gear Acid 2. It would probably be called totally not Metal Gear Acid 2. I don't know.